Hi everyone, today we are going to talk about Introduction to Environmental Science and Ecology, which is our Unit 2. And when we're talking about Introduction to Science or Introduction to Environmental Science and Ecology, there is an activity that we are going to do that follows this presentation. So I would have that activity out. That would be the Introduction to Environmental Science and Ecology activity, or the garden activity. So if you would like to have that document open while we are talking about the material, that would be very helpful for you when you complete the activity. There are not guided notes for this lecture, as it's more information that I'm going over again and some new information that will be included in the activity that you will complete. So first, the difference between environmental science and ecology. Basically, the main difference is that with environmental science, we're incorporating human impacts. So ecology, we're just kind of studying passively how organisms interact with their environment. And for environmental science, we're actually studying the impact that humans have on ecology. Defining an ecosystem. So we talked a little bit about ecosystems when we discussed levels of organization. Ecosystems are communities of organisms, so different populations living together, but also they're abiotic factors. So an abiotic factor is anything that is not alive, and that was never living. So water is not alive and it was never living. Rocks aren't alive, they were never alive. Air. These are all components of an ecosystem that are abiotic. Ecosystems do not always have clear boundaries. They are open systems, which means that one ecosystem might bleed into another. Components of an ecosystem. So what are the parts of an ecosystem? In order to survive, ecosystems need 5 basic components, and this is something that you'll need to know. Ecosystems need energy. A lot of our energy is going to start with the sun. They need mineral nutrients. So we talked about all of the nutrients and elements that we require: nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, oxygen, hydrogen, just to name a few. They need water. We need oxygen and carbon dioxide, and we need living organisms in order to have an ecosystem. So it's the living things and the non-living things. And one part of an ecosystem is destroyed, then that's going to change the entire system. So there's also this domino effect when we talk about the ecosystem. They're very fragile. Even changing one component would change the entire system. Biotic versus abiotic. So we learned in our last presentation that bio, that prefix, means life. So biotic means any of the living factors in an ecosystem or things that were once alive. So even if you have a stick on the ground, that is a biotic factor because it was once living. Abiotic factors are environmental factors that are not associated with living organisms. So gases, liquid, water, these are all things, dirt, soil, that were never living, so they are part of the abiotic factors of an ecosystem. What are abiotic factors? So some examples of abiotic factors and things that you can look for when you're completing your garden activity or intro to science activity would be sunlight, water, soil, wind, temperature, and natural disturbances, so storms and things of that nature, weather. Just a diagram that gives you a little bit of a visualization of abiotic factors versus biotic factors. So biotic factors can be protists, single-celled organisms, fungi, plants, bacteria, archaea, or animals. And biotic factors are air, salt, or the salinity of water, soil, water, light, temperature, minerals, and the rocks that are made of the minerals, pH, or the acidity of water, and humidity, so the water vapor in the air. This just gives you a little bit more information on what you're looking for when you're looking at biotic factors and what you are looking for when you're looking at abiotic factors. So looking at this image, see if you can list some abiotic and biotic factors. And you can pause me here and see if you can list them on your own. And then I'll go ahead and give some examples. So for abiotic factors, we have the sunlight, we have the air in this ecosystem, we have the water and the rocks that the water is flowing over. We have the soil that these mosses and plants are growing on. For the biotic factors, even though this tree has fallen and is no longer alive, it's still a biotic factor because it was once living. We also have the mosses, the ferns, the trees, any organisms that are living in the water. These would all be considered biotic factors. Just to review the levels of organization, if we start at the bottom, we're starting with the smallest organism, and we know that from our last presentation we can break an organism down to even smaller components, but just to keep things simple, we have a single organism. Populations are a group of organisms living in the same area that are the same species, so we could even say that species might go in between these two. And what this means for a population is that these organisms are similar enough to interact and reproduce. A community is a group of populations living in the same area. We're only talking about living things when we talk about a community. We're only talking about populations that live together. Ecosystem, now we're talking about the community, so all the different populations that live together, but we're also talking about the abiotic factors, the rocks, the sun, the air, the soil, the water. And then the biosphere is kind of our all-encompassing. When we talk about biomes, could go in between ecosystem and biosphere, but this would be everything stitched together, making up all life on the planet. The difference between organisms and species. So an organism is a single life, it's a single life process that's independent of any other. Every organism is a member of a species, and a species is a group of organisms that are closely related. So their DNA is similar enough that they can mate and reproduce, but that they also reproduce an offspring that is fertile. So a horse and a donkey, you might know that they create a mule, but mules are actually sterile. They're not able to reproduce. So a mule is not its own species. Populations. So when we take the same species living in an area and we talk about the population, we're talking about the different organisms that are interacting in the same area, but they're the same species. They can mate and reproduce. And basically the main thing to recognize is that they're living in the same geographical area. So members of the same species that live on different continents do not consist of the same population because they're not able to interact with each other. So an example, field mice in Maine will not interact with field mice in Texas. So even though they're part of the same species, they are not a part of the same population. Members of a population usually breed with one another rather than with members of another population. So bison tend to mate with another member of the same herd, and wildflowers tend to pollinate other flowers within their field. So geographic proximity is very important when talking about the reproduction of a population. Communities, so now we're incorporating not just members of the same species, but various species. So various populations living together, and they are a part of the same community. So the main difference between communities is that they are different species. They don't necessarily, they can't all mate and reproduce. Land communities. Land communities are dominated by species of plants, which determine what other organisms can live in that community. So if the community does not provide the specific plants that an organism would need for sustaining a nutritious life, then they aren't going to be a part of that community. So in this way, the plants really kind of control what type of community there is. A habitat is a place that fits the niche of a specific organism. So it has all of the things that that living thing needs. It has specific characteristics that the organism needs to live and survive. If anything changes in the habitat, then it could be detrimental to the species if they're unable to adapt. Organisms tend to be very well suited for their natural habitats. usually cannot survive for long periods of time away from natural habitats. Zoos breed different types of species. Obviously, if you're raised in captivity, then you're not going to necessarily be able to be mixed in again with the natural habitat. Okay, so now that you know about levels of organization and also the specifics of abiotic and biotic factors and the difference between ecology and environmental science, you're ready to complete the garden activity, or what's also called the Intro to Environmental Science and Ecology activity. And hopefully by looking around and observing your natural habitat, you'll have a greater understanding of these levels and factors. Reach out to your teacher if you have any questions.